Case 1. The chilling murder of Barrett Lynn Beck. Barrett Lynn Beck was born on April 12, 1972, in the quiet town of Sturtevant, Wisconsin, a place where life moved slowly, and the most exciting news was usually small-town gossip. Crime was rare, and families felt safe letting their kids roam the streets until dusk. Barrett grew up in a loving home with her parents and younger brother. She was bright, friendly, and quick to make friends. Music was her greatest passion. She played violin in the school orchestra, losing herself in the melodies she created. In high school, she started dating Kurt, and their young romance carried on after graduation. By the summer of 1990, Barrett was 18 and standing at the threshold of adulthood. College was on the horizon, though she hadn't settled on a major. Only that music, in some form, would be at the center of her future. In the meantime, she took a job at a local company, determined to save money before starting school. That July, her employer signed her up for a 3-day computer training seminar in Appleton, a city several hours away. It was her first solo business trip, a milestone that made her both nervous and excited. Her parents, cautious by nature, weren't thrilled at the idea of her driving such a long distance alone. But eventually, they agreed. She was an adult now, and this was an opportunity she couldn't pass up. On the morning of July 17th, they loaded the family van, helped her pack, and waved goodbye as she headed down the road. Barrett promised to call them the moment she checked into her hotel. Hours passed. The phone never rang. As daylight faded, her parents' unease grew. The trip should have taken only a few hours, yet when they called the hotel, the clerk told them Barrett had never arrived. Frantic, they began phoning her coworkers, friends, anyone who might have seen her that day. No one had. They clung to hope. Maybe she'd changed her plans, stayed with someone she knew, or checked into a different hotel. They decided to wait until morning. But when the seminar began without her, hope turned into dread. Barrett's parents called the police, and with that call, an investigation began. One that would uncover far darker truths than anyone in Sturtevant could have imagined. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us grow. A huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. When Barrett failed to arrive at the seminar or contact her family, the police finally stepped in. But in those first crucial hours, they did little more than circulate a notice with a description of her van. She was legally an adult, and without any clear signs of foul play, investigators decided against launching a full-scale search. They would wait. That wait stretched into another day with no sign of Barrett, no phone call, no van. It wasn't until the morning of July 19th that a break came. A tip about a vehicle matching the description parked outside a supermarket in the small town of West Bend, roughly 65 miles from her home. Officers arrived quickly and confirmed the worst of their suspicions. It was the Beck family's van. The doors were locked. Barrett was nowhere in sight. Inside, the first clue came from a crumpled Walgreens receipt. It was time-stamped July 17th, the day she vanished, and traced to a store just across the street. When police spoke with the cashier, they learned Barrett had been there around noon. She was alone, cheerful, and showed no signs of distress. But the other details were far more disturbing. The van's stereo and radar detector were missing, possible evidence of a robbery. Cigarette ash was scattered across the seats and floor, an odd detail given that Barrett never smoked. There was so much of it that detectives believed someone had spent considerable time inside the vehicle. Her belongings told their own story. Almost everything she had packed for the trip remained. Her red shirt, the one she wore when she left home, was on the floor, torn at the hem. The dress she'd planned for the seminar lay nearby, along with stockings knotted tightly together. Even the shoes she'd worn that morning were still there. One detail gnawed at investigators. Before Barrett's parents handed her the van, they'd written down the mileage for her expense report. Now, the odometer showed 461 miles more than when she'd left. Given that the supermarket lot was just 65 miles from her home, someone had clearly driven the van much farther before abandoning it. 2 discarded coffee cups, one from McDonald's, the other from Burger King, added to the puzzle. It was unlikely Barrett would have made both stops in such a short trip. By now, detectives were convinced someone else had been in the van. The evidence pointed toward an abduction. A simple vehicle theft seemed implausible. Barrett had been missing for days, and there was still no trace of her. Investigators began by retracing Barrett's last known steps, determined to map out the hours before she vanished. They learned that she hadn't driven straight toward Appleton after leaving home. Instead, she made a detour to see her boyfriend, Kurt. According to Kurt, the two talked for a while about her upcoming trip, the seminar, and plans for the future, before she said goodbye and headed out. He insisted he hadn't heard from her since. Detectives found nothing linking him to her disappearance. Still, one detail caught their attention. Kurt had given Barrett a ring, a gift she reportedly never removed. When police processed the van, that ring turned up in a strange place, tucked beneath one of the floor mats. The positioning suggested it had been deliberately hidden. It was unlikely to have simply slipped from her finger and ended up there by chance. If someone else had removed it, why take the time to hide it? Especially when they'd stolen the stereo and radar detector, yet left behind this clearly valuable piece of jewelry. Meanwhile, forensic technicians scoured the van for evidence, uncovering dozens of fingerprints. Friends and family willingly provided their prints, allowing police to eliminate them from the investigation. What remained were several unidentified prints, including ones on a coffee cup, the inside of a window, and the cosmetic boxes Barrett had purchased at Walgreens. But without a suspect for comparison, these leads stalled. While police chased down every tip, Barrett's family mounted their own search. They rallied more than 100 volunteers, gave interviews to local television stations, and scoured hundreds of miles along the route she was supposed to take. They even raised a $75,000 reward for information. The weeks dragged on with no breakthrough. Then, on August 22nd, the call came. A farmer driving along a remote country road, about 18 miles from where Barrett's van had been found, spotted something in the roadside ditch. Curious, he pulled over. What he saw stopped him cold. It was a body. Authorities arrived quickly, confirming the remains were female. But the intense summer heat had taken its toll. The body was so badly decomposed that visual identification was impossible. Even so, investigators feared they already knew who it was. A comparison with dental records soon confirmed their worst suspicions. The remains belonged to Barrett Lynn Beck. The state of Barrett's remains made the medical examiner's job painfully difficult. No definitive cause of death could be determined, though strangulation was considered a strong possibility. What they did know was undeniable. This was murder. One detail chilled investigators to the core. A torn piece of fabric from Barrett's own shirt had been tied around her head, covering her eyes like a blindfold. It suggested she had been taken against her will, held captive, though likely not for long. The medical report indicated her body had been in the ditch for more than a month. That meant she was almost certainly killed on the same day she was abducted. Yet the grim discovery brought no closer answers. Weeks turned into months, and the case stubbornly refused to break open. Detectives interrogated suspects, pursued tips, and scoured for evidence, but every lead ended the same way: dead. Investigators formed a working theory. Perhaps Barrett had been the victim of a robbery that spiraled out of control. They believed that when she parked at Walgreens and went inside, someone broke into her van intending to steal valuables. If Barrett returned mid-theft, the situation could have escalated. Faced with the threat of being caught, the intruder may have decided to abduct her, ending her life later that same day before leaving her in the roadside ditch. The odometer supported this theory. After her disappearance, the van had clocked nearly 500 additional miles, far beyond the short distance from her home to the lot where it was found. It suggested the killer had driven aimlessly or traveled extensively before abandoning it. If robbery was indeed the motive, police needed to look closely at offenders with a history of vehicle-related crimes. Before long, one name stood out: Craig, a man already suspected of stealing multiple cars near the area where Barrett was last seen. Craig's methods raised eyebrows. He had a habit of using stolen vehicles to commit other crimes, often driving them for days before discarding them. The parallels to Barrett's case were hard to ignore. Digging deeper, detectives discovered that not long after Barrett vanished, Craig had been arrested for an armed bank robbery. During his arrest, police searched his belongings and found something that made their stomachs tighten: a woman's hairbrush, tangled with strands of blonde hair. But in 1990, forensic science had limits. DNA analysis was in its infancy, and without the means to compare the hair to Barrett's, the brush remained a haunting but unproven connection. Detectives soon learned that Craig had the means and opportunity to commit the crime. But opportunity alone was far from enough to prove guilt. Then came a revelation that jolted the investigation. While interviewing Craig's acquaintances, one friend dropped a bombshell. Craig had allegedly confessed to killing Barrett. According to this witness, Craig even showed him her body inside the van before disposing of it. The confession claim instantly elevated Craig to the top of the suspect list. But there was a problem, a big one. None of the fingerprints recovered from Barrett's van matched Craig's, and when confronted, he denied any involvement, leaving investigators with little more than hearsay. For months, they hunted for something, anything, that could tie him to the murder. At one point, they considered charging him based solely on his friend's testimony, hoping it would be enough for a conviction. But without physical evidence, prosecutors knew the case would collapse in court. Still, Craig remained their prime suspect. For years, his name hovered over the investigation, each new tip or lead circling back to him, yet never quite landing. The case dragged on for decades, cold but not forgotten. Everything changed in 2013, when the file was turned over to a dedicated cold case unit for a fresh look. Detectives dove into the dusty boxes of evidence, only to face an infuriating setback. Several pieces of Barrett's clothing, listed in official records, were missing. Somewhere along the line, likely through human error, these items had been discarded. Even so, the team sent the remaining evidence for modern forensic testing and ordered a fresh comparison of the fingerprints found in the van. That's when they made a startling discovery. In the 23 years since Barrett's murder, those prints had never been digitized. They existed only on paper. Once the prints were finally uploaded into the national database, the wait was short. The lead detective soon received a call from the lab. There was a match. 5 of the fingerprints belonged to a man named Dennis Brandner, a name that had never once appeared in the original investigation. A quick background check revealed he had an extensive criminal record, which explained how his prints ended up in the system. Dennis Brandner's rap sheet was long and unsettling. In his younger years, he served time for stealing cars and later faced arrest for breaking into a home. In another disturbing episode, he crept into a hotel room where a woman was staying, stole her underwear, and left behind notes laced with explicit, disturbing messages. But one incident stood out to detectives for its chilling similarity to Barrett's case. Years earlier, Dennis had broken into his ex-wife's car while she was at work. When she returned and got inside, he pulled a knife and tried to abduct her. She managed to escape and report him, but the act revealed a dangerous pattern of predatory behavior. As investigators dug deeper, they learned that at the time of Barrett's murder, Dennis was working as a long-haul truck driver in the same region. His job took him through countless towns and cities, giving him both the mobility and opportunity to commit such a crime. Still, detectives moved carefully. First, they ruled out any personal connection between Dennis and Barrett or her family that might have explained his fingerprints in her van. But one detail was impossible to ignore. One of those prints was found on a box of cosmetics Barrett had purchased just minutes before she disappeared. That placed Dennis in her van at a critical moment, dramatically increasing suspicions. Detectives decided it was time to confront him. At his home, Dennis denied knowing Barrett and insisted he had nothing to do with her death. But when told his fingerprints had been found in her van, his composure cracked. He grew visibly nervous, at times breaking into tears, though he still clung to his claim of innocence. Investigators pressed on. Interviews with people from Dennis's past uncovered a series of unsettling coincidences. His ex-wife revealed that Dennis had always favored Burger King, visiting it often. Barrett, on the other hand, preferred McDonald's. Inside her van, detectives had found coffee cups from both chains, one of which, from Burger King, bore Dennis's fingerprint. Then came an even stranger lead. Former co-workers from a factory job Dennis held after Barrett's murder recalled that he kept a photograph of a young blonde woman in his toolbox. After so many years, it was impossible to confirm the woman's identity, but the resemblance to Barrett was strong enough to leave investigators deeply unsettled. One former co-worker of Dennis shared a chilling memory. She said he once told her outright that he wanted to kidnap and assault her. Meanwhile, police were still gathering evidence when a breakthrough came from the crime lab. Despite the earlier loss of some of Barrett's belongings, several items from her van had survived in storage, including a cigarette pack wrapper. Using modern forensic technology, analysts discovered a fingerprint on it. It matched Dennis. Compiling the case against him took nearly a year. Then, in March 2015, Dennis Brandner was arrested and charged with the murder of Barrett Lynn Beck. But almost immediately, prosecutors faced a major hurdle. While Dennis's fingerprints were inside Barrett's van, they feared this alone might not secure a conviction. By 2015, juries had come to see DNA as the gold standard in criminal trials. Fingerprints, while damning, did not place him at the scene of the killing in the same way, and left room for doubt. It was entirely possible, the defense could argue, that Dennis had been inside the van under unrelated circumstances, and despite exhaustive forensic work, investigators had found no DNA tying him directly to Barrett, her belongings, or her vehicle. Still, the case moved forward. The trial began in the summer of 2016. From the start, Dennis's defense attorney attacked the prosecution's case, hammering the lack of DNA evidence and insisting that fingerprints alone were not proof of murder. The strategy worked. Jurors were divided. Without a unanimous verdict, the trial ended in a mistrial. The setback was crushing for Barrett's family. After 26 years of not knowing what had happened to her, they now faced the possibility that the man police believed had killed her might never be held accountable. But prosecutors weren't ready to give up. They immediately announced plans for a retrial, scheduled for early 2018. This time, they built their case on the theory that Dennis had attacked Barrett with the intent to sexually assault her before killing her. But proving intent beyond a reasonable doubt would be an uphill battle. The outcome of the retrial and the severity of any sentence depended on it. If the jury rejected their case, Dennis could never be tried for the murder again. He would walk free. After long consultations with Barrett's family, prosecutors made a difficult decision. They offered Dennis a plea deal: plead guilty to second-degree manslaughter in exchange for avoiding another uncertain trial. The plea deal ensured Dennis Brandner would serve time behind bars, though far less than Barrett's family had hoped. In exchange for pleading guilty to second-degree manslaughter, he received the maximum sentence allowed: 10 years. With credit for the time he'd already spent in jail since his arrest, his total term was effectively reduced to 7 years. He would walk out of prison at age 71. For Barrett's parents, the punishment felt painfully light, but they understood the grim reality. Without the plea, there was a very real chance Dennis could be acquitted and never face justice at all. Reluctantly, they agreed to the deal, believing it was their only path to some measure of closure after nearly 3 decades of uncertainty. In the years that followed, they found a way to honor their daughter's memory. They established a scholarship at her high school, awarded for excellence in music, a fitting tribute to Barrett's passion. The scholarship continues to this day, keeping her name and love for music alive for future generations. There was also one final development in the case's long history. Decades after Barrett's murder, investigators finally discredited the damning statement that had made Craig, the original prime suspect, seem so suspicious. One of Craig's acquaintances had claimed Craig showed him Barrett's body in her van, but the truth was far less dramatic and far more infuriating. The man had fabricated the story entirely, driven by a personal grudge, and had pieced together his account from details he'd overheard from police. His false accusation had cast a shadow over Craig for years. It had taken 28 years, countless false leads, and 2 prime suspects before Barrett Lynn Beck's case was officially closed. For her family, the resolution was bittersweet, justice of a sort, but never enough to fill the void left behind. Case 2. Joy Hibbs, murder, arson, and a 31-year fight for justice. Joy Hibbs was born on September 23, 1955, in the small town of Chief, Florida. The youngest of 9 children in a close-knit, loving family. Surrounded by siblings, she grew up with a deep appreciation for the outdoors. Hiking, fishing, and anything that kept her close to nature brought her joy. She was also athletic, a dedicated runner who once competed in marathons, and a passionate football fan who never missed a game. In high school, Joy met Charlie, the young man who would become her lifelong partner. Their connection was instant, and not long after graduation, they were married. The couple relocated to Pennsylvania, settling in the small town of Cuddon. Joy had long dreamed of a career in the medical field. Without formal qualifications, she began in entry-level roles, working as a veterinary assistant before enrolling in local college courses to earn a degree. Her determination paid off. She became a physical therapist at a small clinic, just a short drive from home. By 1975, at the age of 20, Joy was a mother. She and Charlie welcomed a daughter, followed 3 years later by a son. They settled into a quiet suburban neighborhood where life appeared ideal, a perfect family living the American dream. That dream shattered on April 19th, 1991. It was a Friday. Joy, now 35, was scheduled to work an evening shift. That morning, she helped her children get ready for school, kissed her husband goodbye as he left for work, and prepared for her day. She ran errands, stopping at the grocery store before heading to the bank to cash a check. At around 1 p.m., her 12-year-old son, David, came home from school. Spotting his mother's car in the driveway, he was eager to share the good grades he'd earned that day. But as he approached the house, his excitement gave way to confusion, and then dread. Thick smoke billowed from inside. At first, David thought maybe his mother had left something cooking on the stove. But when he opened the front door, he was met with the sight of flames ripping through the interior. Panic set in. David tried to push inside to find his mom, but the choking smoke and searing heat forced him back. Neighbors, seeing the smoke, called the fire department. Firefighters arrived quickly and fought the blaze, eventually containing it. In the final room they searched, they found a body. Paramedics and police on the scene assumed it was Joy, but the burns were so severe that visual identification was impossible. The remains were sent to the medical examiner for confirmation. Word of the fire spread quickly through the small town. At school, Joy's teenage daughter heard fragments of the news and rushed home, only to find her younger brother crying in the yard. Moments later, Charlie arrived. When police told him a body had been found inside the house, he collapsed on the spot, overcome with shock. At the time, firefighters were still assessing the scene, unsure what had sparked the blaze. But in the chaos, Joy's son couldn't stop blaming himself. He kept thinking about the messy tangle of cords in his bedroom, his computer, the fish tank, everything plugged into a single outlet. Since his mother's body had been discovered in that room, he convinced himself the fire had started there, and that she died trying to put it out. But as crews worked to extinguish the flames, something didn't add up. Firefighters noticed burn patterns that suggested multiple points of origin, an almost impossible occurrence in an accidental fire. A closer inspection confirmed it. There were 4 separate places in the house where the blaze had been deliberately set. On the kitchen stove, all 4 gas burners had been left on, with bits of debris scattered across them. It appeared the arsonist had used the stove to help spread the fire throughout the house. The theory of arson was soon supported by the medical examiner's findings. The body was officially identified as Joy. But there was no smoke in her lungs. She had been dead before the fire started, and the cause of death was as brutal as it was clear. Joy's body bore multiple cuts, bruises, and stab wounds. This was no tragic accident. It was murder. With that confirmation, the investigation shifted to a homicide case. But the fire had destroyed most of the home, leaving few clues to work with. There was no foreign DNA on Joy's body, no obvious physical evidence to lead the way. With the trail already cold, detectives turned their attention to the next step, figuring out who could have wanted Joy Hibbs dead. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us grow. A huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. The first person police turned their attention to was Joy's husband, Charlie. He'd been at work when the fire started, but investigators couldn't completely rule out the possibility that he'd left, committed the crime, and returned to establish an alibi. In homicide cases, spouses are often scrutinized first, and this one would be no different. Still, There were no signs of marital strife. Friends and family described the couple as happy, and those who knew Charlie said he seemed genuinely shattered by his wife's death. Despite that, detectives kept him on their list of potential suspects, at least for a time, before shifting focus to other leads. They began questioning Joy's friends and co-workers, probing for any hint of conflict or anyone who might have wanted to harm her. The responses were unanimous. Joy was kind, caring, and well-liked. She didn't make enemies. Investigators also considered whether she might have been a random target. Every Friday, Joy cashed a check at the bank, and the day of the fire was no different. She would have been carrying some cash. Yet when police searched the home, they found her wallet empty on the couch and her purse dumped out on the kitchen floor, as if someone had been searching for something specific. Robbery seemed plausible at first, but the theory quickly lost strength. Aside from a relatively small amount of cash, nothing else in the house was missing. Valuables had been left untouched, suggesting this was no simple burglary. That led detectives to a far more disturbing possibility. Joy's murder had been targeted, and soon, unsettling details began to surface about the months leading up to her death. Her family recalled a string of strange, troubling incidents. On one occasion, someone hurled a brick through the Hibbs window. Another time, the front door was damaged, and the tires on Joy's car were slashed while it sat parked outside the house. Back then, Joy and Charlie had brushed them off as random acts of vandalism. But in the wake of her murder, those incidents felt less like coincidences and more like warning signs. As detectives worked to piece the puzzle together, they turned their attention to Joy's neighbors, hoping someone had seen or heard something. No one recalled anything unusual during the earlier incidents of vandalism. But when asked about the day of the fire, several neighbors shared something that made investigators sit up. Just before the blaze, a blue Monte Carlo had been seen parked in front of Joy's house. No one caught a glimpse of the driver. No one saw the license plate. When police mentioned the car to Joy's family, they got their first real lead. Joy's son said his mother had a friend named April, someone who occasionally drove a car like that. Digging deeper, investigators learned April and her husband, Robert, had once lived just a few houses away. Recently, however, they'd lost their home due to financial problems and moved out of the neighborhood. According to friends and relatives, Joy and April had become close soon after April moved in. But there was more to the story. Neighbors described Robert as volatile, quick to anger, and prone to violence. Rumors swirled that he abused his wife. Because of this, April often sought refuge at Joy's house, bringing her kids along to escape the tension at home. Joy's son recalled at least one heated exchange between Robert and his mother. He'd overheard a phone call in which Robert not only shouted at her, but threatened her outright. When detectives ran Robert's name, a troubling picture emerged: a long criminal history, much of it drug-related. The more they learned, the more they considered him a viable suspect. Perhaps Robert resented Joy for supporting his wife, seeing her as a threat to his control. In that scenario, his anger could have easily escalated to violence. The police reached out to the narcotics division, whose officers knew Robert well from prior arrests. They agreed to help, even offering to speak with him directly. When confronted, Robert denied any involvement in Joy's death. He claimed he'd been out of town for the entire weekend, on a family vacation with April and the kids. But detectives noticed a glaring problem with his alibi. The murder happened on a Friday afternoon. Even if Robert had left town later that day, there was still plenty of time for him to stop by Joy's house first. One thing caught the officers' attention when they first spoke with Robert: a fresh scratch running along his arm. But when asked about it, he brushed it off and continued to insist he had nothing to do with Joy's murder. In the days that followed, Robert shut down completely. On the advice of his lawyer, he stopped speaking with investigators. When they asked him to take a polygraph, he refused. Every attempt to reach him after that went nowhere. With his cooperation gone, detectives turned to physical evidence that might connect him to the crime. They revisited the neighbors who had spotted the blue Monte Carlo outside Joy's house and took them to Robert's residence, hoping for a match. It wasn't the break they'd hoped for. Robert's Monte Carlo wasn't blue. It was black. And the neighbors were adamant it didn't look like the car they'd seen that day. Detectives also dug into Robert's alibi and found it solid. Records showed he and his family had checked into a hotel in another city on Friday, the same day as the murder. Even more, phone records confirmed that just before leaving home, he'd been on a call with one of his wife's friends, around the very time Joy was killed. With no evidence tying him to the scene, Robert began to slip from the top of the suspect list. The investigation shifted back toward Joy's husband, Charlie. This time, new whispers emerged. Several of Joy's co-workers told police she had been receiving threatening phone calls in the weeks before her death. One co-worker admitted she suspected the caller might have been Charlie but had never confronted Joy about it. Despite the suspicion, Charlie's alibi remained firm. Multiple co-workers confirmed he'd been at work all day on April 19th. Still, detectives couldn't entirely dismiss the idea that he might have slipped away, committed the crime, and returned unnoticed. They brought him in for questioning multiple times and had him take several polygraph tests. Nothing in his demeanor suggested guilt. He had no criminal record, no known history of violence, and no signs of aggression toward Joy during their marriage. Eventually, police decided Charlie's involvement was unlikely. With no suspects left and no fresh leads, the case ground to a halt. With no solid evidence and no clear suspects, the investigation into Joy's murder stalled. The case was quietly pushed aside, revisited only occasionally, and each time, detectives ran headfirst into a dead end. Years passed, decades even. Joy's children grew up under the shadow of their mother's unsolved murder, the unanswered questions haunting them. Her son, in particular, refused to let it go. He repeatedly contacted police, pleading for a renewed investigation. Each time he left disappointed. In one conversation, detectives told him bluntly that they still suspected his father, Charlie, but they simply didn't have the evidence to prove it. Then, in 2014, 23 years after Joy's death, the case was finally reopened. It was handed to the Cold Case Unit, where a fresh team of detectives began combing through every piece of evidence from the beginning. Almost immediately, something unusual jumped out. A large portion of the communication with Robert, one of the original prime suspects, had been handled not by homicide detectives, but by the narcotics division. It was strange, and it was wrong. This was a murder investigation, yet an unrelated department had been deeply involved. The new team couldn't understand why, so they sought answers from one of the original investigators. At first, the retired detective refused to discuss the case, but after multiple attempts, he finally agreed to talk. What he revealed stunned them. From the start, Robert had been considered the most likely suspect, but there was a catch, one that tied the hands of the original investigative team. They'd been told, in no uncertain terms, to stay away from him. Pursuing Robert too aggressively was off the table. The reason? Robert wasn't just a neighborhood troublemaker. He was a confidential informant for the narcotics division. And not just any informant. He was central to a massive, years-long operation targeting a major drug trafficking network. To protect that operation, the department had decided not to risk alienating him. As a result, homicide investigators conducted only a superficial probe into his possible involvement in Joy's murder, then quietly moved on. The revelations about Robert's protected status marked a turning point in Joy's case. The new team of detectives decided to start from scratch, dismantling his decades-old alibi piece by piece. Back in 1991, police had determined that Robert was accounted for at the time of the murder. But the cold case investigators knew they couldn't simply trust outdated reports. They would verify everything themselves. Their first step was to track down Robert's wife's friend, the one he supposedly called around the time Joy was killed. She confirmed the call happened, but her memory carried a critical detail the original investigators had missed. It wasn't in the afternoon, as police once believed. It was much later, closer to evening. Next, they re-interviewed witnesses who had allegedly seen Robert with his wife and kids checking into a hotel that day. The original case file claimed the family arrived shortly after lunch, but the witnesses now said it was around 5 p.m., hours later than reported. That shift in the timeline changed everything. It meant Robert had more than enough time to commit the murder before joining his family. Finally, detectives sought out April herself. By now, she and Robert were divorced, but she still backed his alibi, insisting there was no way he could have been involved. Investigators pressed her repeatedly, hoping for cracks in her story. None came. With April holding firm, the team pushed forward, re-examining every piece of evidence, chasing down every lead. Years passed with no breakthrough. Then, in 2016, something completely unexpected happened. April walked into the police station and said she was ready to talk. A string of personal hardships, she explained, had forced her to reevaluate the past, and what she told them shattered the case wide open. April admitted she had lied about Robert's alibi from the very beginning. The truth, she said, was far darker. On the day of the murder, Robert came home covered in blood. When she demanded to know what had happened, he looked at her and said, "I stabbed someone and set a house on fire." After Robert's chilling admission, he ordered April to pack up the kids. They left for another city under the guise of a weekend getaway. Robert brought along a large bag, and during a walk in the park, he slipped away into the woods alone. When he returned minutes later, the bag was gone. It wasn't until a few days later, when detectives came knocking, that April began to understand the truth. She confronted Robert, begging him to come clean. Instead, he lashed out, beating her and threatening to frame her for the murder if she ever spoke up. For decades, fear kept her silent, but now she was ready to tell the truth. Her testimony transformed the investigation. Still, detectives knew a jury would want more, hard evidence or a confession. So they crafted a plan and asked April to help. They wired her with recording equipment and staged a visit from officers who questioned her about Joy's murder. Immediately after they left, April called Robert, sounding nervous. She told him the police had been asking questions and she didn't know how to respond. Robert's reaction was instant and revealing. He told her to refuse to speak with investigators and to avoid answering anything about the case. There was no outrage, no denial, only an urgent push to shut the conversation down. The recording became a critical piece of evidence. With it, detectives began building their case, a process that would take several years. Finally, in May 2022, Robert was arrested. He continued to deny any involvement, but the district attorney believed the evidence. combined with April's testimony, was strong enough to secure a conviction. April was set to be the key witness, and the case seemed poised for trial. But then came another twist. When Robert's son took the stand, he dropped a bombshell. He testified that after the staged phone call between Robert and April, his father had phoned him as well. During that conversation, Robert admitted the police were questioning April about the murder, and that there was a real chance he could spend the rest of his life in prison. Robert told his son he wanted to prepare him for what might come, and then began talking about Joy's murder. He never gave a direct confession, but his words were unsettling. "I think I did it," he said. The testimony added yet another layer to an already strong case, but prosecutors still needed to address one lingering question: motive. The evidence painted Robert as a man with a long history of conflict with Joy, a volatile temper, and a criminal record. On the day of the murder, it appeared he had stolen the cash Joy withdrew from the bank just hours earlier. Yet there was a darker possibility. After the case made headlines again, Robert's relatives from another state reached out to detectives. They hadn't spoken to him in years, but when they saw Joy's photograph on the news, they were stunned. Joy's face, they said, was eerily similar to someone from Robert's past, his own aunt. When Robert was a teenager, they revealed, he had sexually assaulted and beaten that aunt. The resemblance between her and Joy was undeniable. Detectives began to consider whether Robert's attack on Joy had been sexually motivated. Proving it, after more than 3 decades, was impossible. Even without that certainty, the jury was convinced. Robert was found guilty of Joy Hibbs's murder and sentenced to life in prison. For Joy's family, the verdict was long-awaited justice, but it came with bitter truths. Robert had lived freely for over 30 years, shielded in part because police had chosen to protect a major narcotics investigation rather than pursue a prime suspect in a brutal homicide. In effect, Joy's life had been weighed against a drug case and lost. Still, the family expressed deep gratitude to the cold case detectives, whose persistence had finally brought the truth to light. For Joy's son, there was another measure of relief. The end of a decades-long doubt planted by the original investigation. He now knew his father had no part in the crime that had haunted his family since 1991. Case 3. The murder of Stacey Ann Falcon and Jacob. Stacey Ann Falcon was born on October 23, 1971, in Rayon, Washington. She grew up in a loving home with her parents and older brother, though the family dynamic changed when her parents eventually separated. From an early age, Stacey was known for her bright personality. Outgoing and quick to make friends, she was surrounded by a wide social circle. In high school, she met a young man named John, and the two quickly became a couple. After graduation, they packed up and moved to California, ready to start a life together. A few years later, they welcomed their son, Jacob. But after several years on the West Coast, they decided to return to their hometown. The homecoming didn't bring the fresh start they'd hoped for. Their relationship began to unravel, and eventually, they went their separate ways. Stacey became a single mother, determined to raise Jacob on her own. She found work as a waitress, rented an apartment in a small residential complex, and devoted herself to providing for her son. By the fall of 1994, Stacey was 22 and looking forward to celebrating her birthday. On October 23rd, she decided to surprise her mother with a visit, bringing Jacob along. Though they lived in the same city, Stacey's busy schedule and the distance between their homes meant visits were rare. They spent the day together, celebrating, before Stacy and Jacob returned home. 4 days later, on her next day off, Stacy made plans to celebrate with friends. She left Jacob with a trusted babysitter and spent the night club hopping, enjoying the evening. Just after 1:30 a.m., she picked up Jacob from the babysitter and headed home. Around 2 hours later, as the city stirred awake, a newspaper delivery driver began his morning route. Turning onto a short, dead-end street, he spotted a disturbing scene. A parked car, and on the ground nearby, the bodies of a woman and a young boy. He called 911 immediately. Police and paramedics arrived within minutes. The victims had both been shot. It didn't take long for authorities to confirm their identities: 22-year-old Stacy Falcon and her young son, Jacob. Detectives moved in quickly, combing over the scene for clues. Scattered near the car were several spent bullet casings. Inside, they found Stacy's belongings, including her cell phone, still in place. One detail immediately struck them as odd. Both Stacy's and Jacob's shoes were lying several yards away from the vehicle. It looked as if the killer had deliberately removed them, but the reason was a mystery. The puzzle deepened when they noticed Stacy's wallet and jewelry were untouched, suggesting robbery hadn't been the motive. Then came another clue: 3 small white buttons on the ground. They didn't match anything Stacy had been wearing, leading investigators to suspect they may have been torn from the killer's clothing during a struggle. The car keys were wedged awkwardly between the driver's seat and the door. Nearby, officers discovered used strips of tape. It sparked a theory. Perhaps the attacker had planned to steal the car, leaving Stacy and Jacob restrained. But when the keys weren't immediately found, the situation escalated into violence. The autopsies confirmed both victims died from gunshot wounds. Stacy's body bore multiple defensive injuries, evidence she had fought fiercely. Dirt on her socks and trampled grass beside the car suggested she'd broken free and made a desperate attempt to get inside the vehicle. But before she could escape, the shooter opened fire, killing her and Jacob, then dragged their bodies into the road. Medical examiners found no sign of sexual assault, ruling that out as a motive. With the physical evidence collected, police canvassed the neighborhood for witnesses. A few residents recalled hearing a woman scream, followed by gunshots, around 2:11 a.m. But none had called 911. The area wasn't known for its safety, and gunfire was, sadly, nothing unusual there. No one had seen anything, and for detectives, the trail began to grow cold. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us grow. A huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. With the available evidence, detectives ruled out 2 major motives: robbery and sexual assault. Their focus shifted to Stacy's personal life, starting with those closest to her. That morning, they went to see her mother. She was midway through her shift at a cafe when the detectives arrived to deliver the devastating news. Her reaction was immediate and raw. She bolted from the cafe, running several blocks before collapsing in the street, sobbing uncontrollably. When officers finally calmed her, they gently began their questions. Could she think of anyone who might have wanted to harm her daughter? She told them Stacy had once lived in the same apartment complex as the babysitter she'd left Jacob with that night. But after hearing gunshots near her home one evening, Stacy decided to move. She had since relocated to another neighborhood, though she still occasionally relied on that same babysitter for help. Her mother also mentioned that Stacy had been seeing a man named Rich at the time of her death. By her account, the relationship seemed ordinary. Rich got along well with Jacob and mostly stayed at his own place. Detectives tracked Rich down, He told them he'd spent the evening at a bar near Stacy's apartment complex. Later, while she was still out celebrating her birthday with friends, he went to her apartment and decided to spend the night there, too tired and too buzzed to drive back to his own place. Rich claimed he woke early the next morning and didn't think much of the fact that Stacy and Jacob weren't home. He assumed they had returned while he was sleeping and left again without waking him. He denied any involvement in the murders and even agreed to take a polygraph test. The results were inconclusive. The examiner flagged several responses as questionable, so Rich remained a person of interest. But there was no direct evidence tying him to the killings. Witnesses at the bar confirmed he'd been there that night, and investigators couldn't find a clear motive for him to harm either Stacy or Jacob. With the investigation stalling, detectives began digging deeper into Stacy's personal life, turning their attention to her ex-husband, Jacob's father. He told police that on the night of the murders, he had been out drinking with friends, then returned home, played a few games of pool with his roommate, and went to bed. His friends confirmed the story, but like Rich, his polygraph results showed several concerning responses. Still, without evidence linking him to the crime, detectives couldn't move forward against him. Forensic specialists combed through Stacy's car and all of the items recovered from the scene, searching for foreign DNA or fingerprints. They found nothing. Then, a potential break. Officers received a call from a local hospital about a suspicious man who had arrived in the middle of the night wearing clothes stained with blood. Detectives rushed to question him and seized his clothing for testing. The man claimed the blood came from a fight with his girlfriend and denied any role in the murders. Police held him until the lab results came back. When they did, the findings ended the lead. The blood was not from Stacy or Jacob. The man was cleared and released. Weeks later, another tip surfaced. Investigators learned that before Stacy had picked up her son on the night she was killed, she'd stopped at a grocery store. Pulling the store's CCTV footage, they spotted her speaking to a man, but his identity remained a mystery, and without more to go on, the lead went cold. The next possible lead came from Stacy's phone records. Investigators discovered that the last incoming call she received was from a man named Scott. When questioned, Scott said he'd been at home with his wife and children the night Stacy and Jacob were killed. He admitted he and Stacy had briefly dated in the past, but their relationship ended abruptly when she learned he was married. Even so, they had remained on friendly terms, and his wife confirmed his alibi. Still, Scott caught the detectives' attention. Friends of Stacy recalled an incident at the cafe where she worked. Scott had once left her a $100 tip. For a man with a modest-paying job and a family to support, it was an unusually generous gesture. The more they looked into him, the more they suspected Scott might have been involved in illegal activity, possibly drug dealing. But as intriguing as that lead was, it didn't bring them any closer to solving the double murder. Investigators kept him on their suspect list, unwilling to rule him out. For weeks, the case inched forward without progress. Then, 2 weeks after Stacy and Jacob's murders, something unexpected happened. Scott was found dead. His body had been stuffed into the trunk of an abandoned car. Scott's brother told police that on the day he disappeared, Scott had planned to confront a man named Vince. The two brothers ran a small side business fixing up cars and had installed an expensive sound system in Vince's vehicle. But Vince had never paid them. Scott, his brother said, had gone to demand the money, so he was convinced Vince had killed him. Detectives tracked Vince down. He denied any involvement, but a search of his apartment told a different story. Investigators found traces of Scott's blood inside, and learned Vince had been using Scott's credit card after his death. Vince was arrested for Scott's murder. Detectives on Stacy and Jacob's case questioned him, hoping he might know something about Scott's possible connection to their deaths. But Vince had nothing useful to offer. Another lead gone cold. For months, the investigation into Stacy and Jacob's murders went nowhere. Then, just before his trial for killing Scott, Vince made an unexpected move. He pleaded guilty. In court, Vince claimed he had acted in self-defense. According to his version, Scott had threatened him during a confrontation. Vince went further, alleging that Scott had confessed to killing Stacy because she planned to tell his wife about their affair. He also claimed he and Scott were partners in the illegal drug trade. Detectives weren't quick to believe him. The timing was suspicious. Only days before facing trial for murder, Vince was suddenly casting Scott as both a killer and a drug dealer, while portraying himself as the victim. Still, with no other leads, they had little choice but to follow up. The deeper they dug, the weaker Vince's story became. Scott's wife was adamant. Her husband had been home with her the night Stacy was murdered. He couldn't have been across town committing a double homicide. Scott's brother also dismissed the idea of an ongoing affair between Scott and Stacy, insisting they were close enough that Scott would have confided in him if it were true. As for drugs, his brother flatly denied any involvement, saying they made their living honestly by repairing cars. In the end, detectives concluded Vince's tale didn't add up. It looked like nothing more than a desperate attempt to deflect blame for his own crime. After that, the case went cold once more. Years passed without progress, the file gathering dust. The only person who refused to let it go was Stacy's mother. She kept contacting detectives, but over time, one by one, they either retired or were reassigned. Eventually, she was told the case would be transferred to Seattle's cold case unit. But when she tried to follow up, she learned the unit had been shut down, victim to budget cuts. In the early 2000s, a new lead surfaced. An inmate contacted investigators, claiming that his acquaintance, a man named Charles, had confessed to killing Stacy and Jacob. According to the informant, Charles worked with Stacy at the same cafe, and both were allegedly involved in selling illegal substances. The story went that Stacy had threatened to turn him in, and that threat had cost her life. Detectives were skeptical. The account felt far-fetched, but with no other leads to pursue, they decided to look into Charles's possible connection. They sent all existing evidence from the case back to the lab, hoping advances in forensic technology might reveal traces of DNA missed during the original investigation. But there was a major obstacle. The lab was already drowning in work. Detectives were told they'd have to wait a full year for results. That call finally came in 2002. Using modern tools, analysts had pulled DNA from the gloves and duct tape found at the scene. They had a match, but it wasn't Charles. The profile belonged to someone who had never appeared in the case files, not once. His name was Jerome Jones. When investigators dug into Jones's history, what they found was alarming. His rap sheet stretched back to his teenage years. Robberies, assaults, car thefts, drug charges. Then came the most chilling discovery. In 1995, just 1 year after Stacy and Jacob's murders, Jones and an accomplice had gunned down a businessman outside his California home. In 1998, he was sentenced to life in prison. Investigators soon uncovered a disturbing connection. In 1994, Jerome Jones had been living in the very apartment complex where Stacy once resided, before she moved out over safety concerns, and where her babysitter was still living at the time of the murders. Even more unsettling, Jones had worked at the very club where Stacy spent the night celebrating her birthday with friends. Detectives traveled to another state to question him in prison. Jones flatly denied any involvement. Every follow-up attempt ended the same way: stonewalling and silence. But the science told a different story. Direct DNA testing confirmed that the biological material found on the gloves and duct tape at the crime scene belonged to him. The problem was, those items only provided circumstantial evidence. It was damning, but not enough for a conviction. Determined to strengthen their case, detectives turned to the biological samples taken from the victims' bodies during the original investigation, evidence that had been carefully preserved for decades. This time, forensic experts made a breakthrough. From a sample collected from Stacy's mouth, they identified biological material matching Jones's DNA. The finding not only tied him directly to her, but also revealed that Stacy had been sexually assaulted. More evidence soon followed. Jones's DNA was also discovered beneath Stacy's fingernails, clear signs of a violent struggle. With the case now supported by multiple layers of forensic evidence, detectives approached the district attorney to discuss filing murder charges. But they hit an unexpected roadblock. The DA wasn't convinced the existing evidence was strong enough to definitively secure a conviction for the double homicide. The district attorney, still unsure the case could hold up in court, asked crime scene experts to reconstruct the murders using the newly uncovered evidence. The goal was to build a clearer picture of how Jerome Jones could be connected. What happened next remains murky. Whether the reconstruction was ever carried out is unknown, but the momentum stalled and no charges were filed. Perhaps investigators felt less urgency knowing Jones was already serving a life sentence for another murder. Or maybe they feared the evidence, even with multiple DNA matches, still wouldn't guarantee a conviction. Whatever the reason, the case was shelved yet again. The most devastating part? Police never told Stacy's mother about any of these developments. For years, she had fought relentlessly for answers. But as time passed and investigators moved on or retired, her points of contact disappeared. Refusing to give up, she began piecing together every scrap of information she could find, working alongside her sister. The effort consumed the next 15 years. Then, in 2017, her sister passed away, leaving her to carry on the search alone. Every lead she chased led to a dead end. Then, in 2019, the case caught the attention of a Seattle journalist. He reached out to Stacy's mother, digging into the investigation himself. Eventually, he uncovered a shocking fact. Police had matched DNA from Stacy's body to Jerome Jones, more than 15 years earlier. The journalist was stunned. With multiple DNA matches tying Jerome Jones to the murders, he couldn't understand why no charges had ever been filed. When he shared his discovery with Stacy's mother, she was crushed. For years, she had begged for updates, only to learn that police had been sitting on evidence linking a suspect to her daughter's murder, and done nothing. Seeking answers, the journalist contacted a former detective who had worked the case during that period. Why? He asked. Hadn't Stacy's mother been told about the DNA match? The detective admitted that, at the time, the evidence felt too inconclusive to draw firm conclusions. He also confessed he'd been juggling multiple cases and simply didn't have the time. When the journalist posed the same question to the district attorney, the response was equally disheartening. Notifying victims' families, the DA said, wasn't his responsibility, and it had never even occurred to him to do so. The journalist laid out everything he'd learned in a detailed article. The piece ignited public outrage and brought Stacy and Jacob's case roaring back into the spotlight. A new team of detectives took a fresh look at the evidence. They were stunned to see the DNA results pointing directly at Jerome Jones, and equally shocked that no charges had ever been filed. They began preparing the case for trial. Then, an alarming twist. Jerome Jones, still serving a life sentence for another murder, was unexpectedly granted parole, despite not being eligible for release until at least 2030. The news lit a fire under investigators and prosecutors. If Jones walked free without facing charges for Stacy and Jacob's murders, they might lose their only chance at justice. By early 2022, they moved quickly, filing official charges against him. The moment Jones was released from the California prison, he was extradited to Washington and placed in custody to await trial. Tragically, Stacy's mother never lived to see the day the man accused of killing her daughter and grandson would be brought to justice. She died just 4 months after Jerome Jones's arrest. Even so, prosecutors were determined to see the case through and finally deliver justice for Stacy and Jacob. Drawing on decades of evidence, they pieced together what they believe happened that night. According to investigators, Jones allegedly confronted Stacy almost immediately after she left the babysitter's home. He may have forced her to pull over at gunpoint, or perhaps she stopped for another reason, and he approached the car. Prosecutors believe his initial plan was to steal her vehicle. At some point, that plan escalated. Jones allegedly pulled Stacy from the car and tied her hands, intending to assault her. In the struggle, she broke free and ran back toward the car, where her young son had been waiting. That's when, prosecutors say, Jones pulled the trigger. He shot them both, then dragged their bodies into the road. He attempted to take the car, but the keys were hidden, jammed between the seat and the door. Unable to find them, he fled the scene, leaving behind several pieces of DNA evidence that would later tie him to the murders. In May 2023, during preliminary hearings, Jones pleaded not guilty. The prosecution began preparing for trial. As of now, the trial has yet to begin. Jones remains behind bars, facing the possibility of a life sentence if convicted. It has taken nearly 30 years to reach this point. But at last, the case is on the verge of resolution, bringing long-delayed justice to a mother and her son. The most frustrating part is that Jerome Jones could likely have been charged as early as 2002, just 8 years after Stacy and Jacob were killed. Yet, for reasons that remain unclear to this day, it would take another 2 decades before charges were finally filed. During all that time, Jones remained behind bars for another murder, while Stacy's mother lived in the dark, heartbroken, waiting for justice that never seemed to come. Now, as Jones finally faces the possibility of being convicted for their murders, she will not be here to see it. Case 4. The 1993 stabbing of Carmen Van Huss. Carmen Van Huss was born on October 9, 1973, in Indianapolis, Indiana. She grew up there with her parents and 2 younger brothers, but when she was still a child, her parents separated. Despite the split, Carmen remained very close to her father, often spending long stretches of time with him. From an early age, she showed a love for drawing and a deep affection for animals, especially stray cats. Her parents recalled that she couldn't walk past one without scooping it up and bringing it home. For a time, she dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. Later, she decided to follow her artistic passion instead, setting her sights on a career in the arts. After graduating from high school, Carmen enrolled at Indiana University to study fine arts. To support herself, she took a job at a Pizza Hut, determined not to depend on her parents for money while they were already busy raising her younger brothers. In October 1992, she and her boyfriend rented their first apartment together, choosing a place close to her job. Carmen balanced her classes, her part-time work, and her long-term plans for a creative career. On the night of March 22, 1993, Carmen, then 19, visited her ailing grandmother in the hospital alongside her father and one of her brothers. Afterward, she drove them home. Her father suggested she spend the night. It was already late and her apartment complex was across town. Concerned for her safety, he thought it was the better option. But Carmen insisted she needed to get back. She had laundry to do and wanted her work uniform ready for her Pizza Hut shift the next day. She said her goodbyes and headed home. 2 days later, a friend dropped by the restaurant where Carmen worked, hoping to ask her for help landing a job there. Instead, she was told Carmen wasn't working that day. Speaking with the manager, she learned Carmen hadn't shown up for her shift the day before either. The manager explained that he'd called her several times without getting an answer and assumed she'd quit without notice. But Carmen's friend was immediately uneasy. Carmen was dependable, and quitting without a word didn't sound like her at all. Carmen's friend shared her concerns with the Pizza Hut manager and asked if there was an emergency contact on file. When Carmen was hired, she had listed her father's phone number, so the manager called him. Her father explained that he'd tried to reach her the day before but hadn't gotten an answer. At the time, he assumed she was busy at work, but now he felt a creeping sense of unease. Without hesitation, he drove straight to her apartment complex. The first thing he noticed was her boyfriend's car parked outside. Carmen often borrowed it, and her purse was sitting inside. He walked up to her apartment door and saw a note taped to it from the building manager. It was a complaint. Several neighbors had reported loud noises coming from her apartment late at night and were asking her to keep it down. Her father knocked, but there was no answer. He tried the door. It was unlocked. Inside, he was met with a nightmare. Carmen lay on the floor in a pool of blood, most of her clothes gone. Stunned, he stumbled back out and called for help. Paramedics arrived quickly, but it was too late. Carmen was already dead. This was no accident. She had been murdered. Police were called in immediately. Investigators began processing the scene and canvassing the neighbors for information. The note from the building manager became their first lead. The manager told them several residents had complained about loud noises coming from Carmen's apartment the night of March 22nd. Around 11:30 p.m., neighbors heard her arrive home, and she wasn't alone. A man was with her. As they walked up the stairs to her third-floor unit, Carmen's voice was light, laughing. The man's tone was equally cheerful, calm, almost intimate. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us grow. A huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. Around 1:30 a.m., neighbors heard more noise from Carmen's apartment. This time it wasn't laughter. It was her voice shouting, "Get away from me!" Moments later, footsteps pounded down the hall as someone ran out of the unit. Then, silence. Despite the obvious alarm in her voice, none of the neighbors called the police. The next morning, they simply complained to the building manager about the disturbance. When questioned later, they explained their inaction. They had assumed the man with Carmen that night was her boyfriend, and they didn't think anything criminal was happening. To detectives, the timeline was becoming clearer. Carmen was likely killed right around the time she screamed, nearly 2 full days before her body was found. Inside her apartment, investigators found empty food wrappers and a few beer bottles, signs that Carmen had spent the evening with someone she knew well. She had let him in, shared a meal, and spent hours in his company before the attack began. The living room appeared to be the primary crime scene. A table lay overturned. Pieces of Carmen's torn clothing were scattered across the floor. The scene told a story of violence and resistance. Detectives believed the killer had gone into the kitchen afterward, washing himself clean of blood before fleeing the apartment. The autopsy revealed the full brutality of the crime. Carmen had suffered more than 60 stab wounds from a sharp object. One of her earrings was missing, as if the killer had taken it. She had also been sexually assaulted. Forensic experts were able to recover biological material from the perpetrator. But in 1993, DNA technology was still in its early stages. The samples were preserved, yet no profile could be generated at the time. Forensic experts combed through every piece of evidence from Carmen's apartment, but came up empty. No usable fingerprints. No trace of the killer's DNA. It left detectives with nothing. No physical evidence, no witnesses, and no clear idea of who this mystery man might be. Robbery was quickly ruled out. Nothing of value had been taken from the apartment. The first question investigators asked was the most obvious. Where had Carmen's boyfriend been? And could he have been involved? That theory didn't last long. They soon confirmed he was in Arizona at the time, thousands of miles away. With a rock-solid alibi, he was cleared almost immediately. Detectives then turned their attention to Carmen's circle of friends and acquaintances. Given the evidence and the sexual nature of the crime, they focused on men she knew but wasn't romantically involved with. Friends, co-workers, and others from her daily life. One by one, they were interviewed. None could be connected to the murder. Police could only hope that someone might draw suspicion. Fresh scratches, unusual behavior, or some other indirect clue. But nothing surfaced. A week after Carmen's murder, her family gathered for her funeral. Grief hung heavy in the air, but the pain was about to deepen. As her father stood by her casket, he received a phone call from the hospital. Carmen's grandmother had passed away. 2 crushing losses in the span of days. To make matters worse, the family was already struggling financially and couldn't afford another funeral. Friends and neighbors stepped in, organizing a fundraiser to help cover the costs. Through the generosity of the community, they managed to raise enough to give Carmen's grandmother a proper farewell. In the weeks after Carmen's murder, police worked relentlessly, chasing down every possible lead. They appealed to the public through television, newspapers, and radio, urging anyone with information to come forward. The calls came in, but none of the tips brought investigators any closer to solving the case. Eventually, the trail went cold. Detectives would revisit the file from time to time, but no matter how many times they reviewed the evidence, nothing new emerged. Carmen's family refused to give up. They stayed in constant contact with investigators, gave interviews to local media, and pleaded with the public for any scrap of information that might lead to answers. But their efforts, no matter how determined, never produced a breakthrough. Her father never recovered from the loss. For years, he poured himself into the fight for justice. But in 2002, tragedy struck again. He was killed in a car accident. After his death, the responsibility of keeping Carmen's case alive fell to her younger brother, Jimmy. He maintained regular contact with police, always hoping for an update. But every call ended the same way. There were still no leads. More than a decade passed like this. Year after year, the investigation stalled, each promising thread unraveling into yet another dead end. In 2013, Detective William Carter took a personal interest in Carmen's case. Carter wasn't part of the homicide unit. His day-to-day work focused on other crimes, but he had a passion for cold cases. He'd even solved one before, entirely on his own time. After reaching out to Carmen's family, Carter began combing through the decades-old investigation. Working only outside of his regular hours, progress was slow. His first move was to request a fresh forensic review of the evidence from Carmen's apartment, focusing on any trace of foreign DNA. Experts re-examined several items pulled from a trash bag and managed to recover a partial genetic profile. The problem? It wasn't complete enough to identify anyone. All they could confirm was that the DNA belonged to a man. In 2015, Carter pushed for testing of the biological samples taken from Carmen's body, confident that advances in forensic technology could finally produce a clear profile of the killer. But when the results came back, they threw him a curveball. The DNA from the body, according to the lab, belonged to a woman. Carter knew immediately something was wrong. Digging deeper, he learned the lab had made a major blunder. They had mixed up Carmen's DNA with that of a suspect in another case. He demanded a new analysis. This time, the lab refused, claiming they didn't have the funds, even though the mistake had been theirs. To make matters worse, the police department had already paid the lab $1,600 for the flawed test. There would be no refund. The department refused to authorize another round of DNA testing, but Detective William Carter wasn't ready to walk away. He was convinced that re-examining the evidence could be the key to finally bringing Carmen's killer to justice. So, he took matters into his own hands. In a bold move, Carter launched a crowdfunding campaign, appealing directly to the public for help. To show his commitment, he put in some of his own money. The response was overwhelming. In just 7 hours, the fundraising goal was not only met, but surpassed. Carter announced that any extra funds would be added to the existing $10,000 reward for information about the case. With the money secured, Carter prepared to order a new DNA analysis, this time ensuring the correct samples would be tested. But just 2 days later, he called Carmen's brother with unexpected news. He had been ordered to stop working on the case. The department never explicitly said the decision was tied to the crowdfunding campaign, but the connection was hard to ignore. The fundraiser had triggered a wave of public scrutiny. Why, people asked, was such a critical test not being paid for by the department? And why should ordinary citizens be the ones to fund it? Despite the controversy, Carter had plenty of supporters. Carmen's brother quickly launched a petition demanding that he be reinstated. The petition spread quickly, drawing the attention of local media. Soon, hundreds of angry residents were flooding the police department with calls and emails. The outcry grew so loud that the department was forced to hold a press conference the very same day. They claimed the situation was a misunderstanding and insisted Carter had never been officially removed from the case. To defuse the backlash, they promised to refund every donation and announced that the department would cover the cost of the DNA test themselves. Carter was eventually reinstated on the case, and he wasted no time. His first move was to request a new analysis of the biological samples taken from Carmen's body. This time, the lab worked with the correct evidence and successfully extracted a complete DNA profile belonging to an unknown man. But there was another setback. The profile didn't match anyone in the FBI's national database. The killer's identity remained a mystery. Over the next several years, Carter focused on every man Carmen might have known who could have been inside her apartment that night. He was convinced her killer was someone familiar to her. But despite his persistence, the search went nowhere. By 2023, the case had reached a standstill once again. That's when the police department brought in Parabon Nanolabs, a company renowned for its advanced forensic techniques. Their plan was to use genetic genealogy, a relatively new but increasingly successful investigative method, credited with solving hundreds of cold cases. The process begins by taking DNA from the unidentified suspect and uploading it to public genealogy databases, where people have voluntarily shared their genetic information. Most matches are distant relatives who often have no idea who the suspect is. From there, Parabon's experts build out extensive family trees, methodically ruling out individuals who don't fit, based on factors like age, gender, location, and other key details. Bit by bit, the possibilities are narrowed until the most likely suspect emerges. At that point, it's up to law enforcement to obtain a fresh DNA sample from the individual and confirm the match. After decades with no real progress, detectives knew this might be their last real chance to catch Carmen's killer. After months of painstaking work, the experts finally landed on a name, a man who fit the profile of Carmen's killer. It was 52-year-old Dana Shepard. Investigators discovered that at the time of the murder, Shepard wasn't just living in the same apartment complex. He was Carmen's next-door neighbor. His criminal record was lengthy, though mostly for non-violent offenses: theft, carjacking, driving without a license, and similar crimes. None of these had ever landed his DNA in the FBI's database. The revelation came with another disturbing detail. Shepard's name was completely absent from the original case files. For reasons no one could fully explain, police in 1993 had never considered him a suspect. Perhaps they were fixated on the belief that the killer fled down the stairs, as neighbors had reported hearing footsteps that night, and never thought to look at the man living just steps away from Carmen's front door. By the time the DNA match came through, Shepard was living in Missouri and working as a janitor at a university. Detectives secured a warrant for his DNA and traveled there immediately. When they knocked on his door, Shepard's hands shook, but he didn't resist. He complied with the warrant and provided a sample. That sample was rushed to the lab, and the results came back a perfect match to the DNA recovered from Carmen's body. In September 2024, more than 3 decades after the murder, Dana Shepard was arrested and extradited to Indiana to finally face justice. Despite the damning DNA match, Dana Shepard has continued to deny any role in Carmen VanHoose's murder. The case is now in the hands of the court, with the trial yet to begin. But prosecutors are confident they have the evidence to secure a conviction. According to their theory, Carmen knew Shepard well enough to let him into her apartment that night. They believe he came over for dinner and drinks, and at some point, began making unwanted advances. When Carmen resisted, he allegedly snapped, attacking her with a knife in a violent rage. Shepard has been denied bail and remains in custody while awaiting trial. For Carmen's brother, the naming of a suspect after more than 3 decades is a bittersweet milestone. He's grateful to investigators for finally bringing someone to justice, but he knows the road ahead will be grueling. A trial like this could stretch on for years. If convicted, Shepard faces up to 105 years in prison. Prosecutors may even be holding back additional evidence that could further cement the case. Evidence likely to surface once the trial is underway. But even without it, the DNA match itself could be powerful enough to sway the jury, or pressure Shepard into a plea deal to avoid an even harsher sentence. Case 5. The 1984 murder of schoolgirl Tina Feltz. Tina Feltz was born on April 27, 1969, in Washington State. When she was still young, her parents separated, and Tina moved with her mother to California, settling in the quiet town of Pleasanton. Not long after, her mother remarried a man named Steve, and the couple welcomed a son. Tina, just 6 years old at the time, was overjoyed to become a big sister and eagerly helped care for the baby. Her parents trusted her with babysitting duties far beyond what most children her age would handle. From an early age, Tina showed a strong sense of independence. She thought carefully about her future, and by middle school, she was already mapping out her college plans and setting aside money to one day buy her own car. In 1984, at age 14, Tina was a freshman in high school, and she wasn't exactly happy about it. Naturally quiet and reserved, she kept to a small group of friends. Unfortunately, her shyness made her an easy target for bullies, and she soon found herself on the receiving end of cruel taunts from other girls. She even considered transferring to another school at the end of the year. On April 5th, Tina's day started badly and only got worse. When she walked into the cafeteria, a group of girls began harassing her, threatening to wait for her after school. The school itself had a rough reputation, the kind of place she'd only ended up in because it was closest to home. That very same day, another incident underscored the school's problems. Several boys shoved a classmate into an outdoor trash bin, and when a teacher pulled him out, they discovered he was heavily intoxicated. As it turned out, students had been drinking alcohol during class. Tina's mother had offered to transfer her somewhere safer, but Tina decided to hold out until the school year ended, just a few months away. Still, the day brought yet another blow. She was told she'd have to stay after school as punishment for her frequent tardiness. Tina had once taken the school bus, but that changed after relentless bullying from the same group of girls who tormented her in the cafeteria. The ride became unbearable, so her mother began driving her to and from school instead. But with her mother juggling her own morning routine before work, Tina often ended up running late. The school decided to punish her for her tardiness with after-school detention, but Tina wasn't about to stick around. Instead, she made up her mind to skip it and head straight home. Her house wasn't far, but the walk wasn't exactly simple. From school, she had to follow a narrow path leading to an underpass beneath the highway, then continue a few hundred yards more before reaching her front door. That afternoon, Tina left school around 2:50 p.m. At first, other students were walking the same path, but one by one they veered off toward their own neighborhoods, until she was alone. Roughly 20 minutes later, a truck driver traveling along the highway above the underpass spotted something strange near the tunnel's entrance. A figure lying motionless on the ground. Concerned, he took the nearest exit to turn around and get a better look. When he crossed back over the overpass, his worst suspicion was confirmed. It was a body. Without a cell phone, he searched for the nearest payphone to call for help, but on the way, he saw a police cruiser and flagged it down. Almost simultaneously, officers received another call, this one from a group of students who had been walking the path and stumbled upon the same grim sight. Police raced to the scene. Lying near the mouth of the tunnel was the body of a young girl. From the heavy pool of blood surrounding her, it was immediately clear she had been stabbed multiple times. The area was cordoned off as detectives began their investigation into the brutal daylight killing. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us grow. A huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. The first thing that caught investigators' eyes was a handbag dangling from the low branch of a tree, just a few yards from the body. When officers pulled it down and looked inside, they found identification. The victim was 14-year-old Tina Feltz. A sweep of the area turned up little of value, Detectives bagged several items scattered nearby, including cigarette butts, but nothing immediately tied to the killing. The murder weapon was nowhere to be found. When police broke the news to Tina's mother, they showed her the recovered bag. She confirmed that none of Tina's personal belongings were missing, ruling out robbery as a motive. That left investigators hoping the medical examiner and crime lab might uncover something more concrete. But the results were grim in another way. Tina had been stabbed an astonishing 44 times with what appeared to be a kitchen knife. There was no sign of sexual assault, eliminating another common motive. The sheer number of wounds suggested rage, a frenzied personal attack, more likely committed by someone who knew Tina and carried a deep grudge. Tina's mother told detectives about the relentless bullying her daughter endured at school. Police began scrutinizing each of the girls involved, but the lead went nowhere. Every one of them had also been assigned detention that day and was accounted for by a teacher. Then came a break, or at least something worth chasing. A fellow high school student reported that shortly after school let out, while driving on the highway near the underpass where Tina's body was found, he saw a classmate named Jeff sprinting toward the tunnel. Detectives soon learned that Jeff was no stranger to trouble. Around school, he had a reputation as one of the main bullies, the kind who zeroed in on weaker students and made their lives miserable. Several girls had even accused him of inappropriate behavior. What really set off alarm bells, though, was his habit of carrying a pocket knife everywhere he went. When officers brought him in for questioning, they immediately spotted a fresh cut on his finger. Jeff first claimed he'd sliced it at work while cutting pizza. Later, he changed his story, saying he'd hurt himself removing a vent cover. The shifting explanation was enough for police to secure a search warrant for his home. Inside, they found 2 hunting knives, both of which were sent to the lab for testing. But results came back clean. No traces of blood, no forensic link to Tina's murder. Jeff denied any involvement, and without hard evidence, detectives couldn't make an arrest. That was the core problem in this case. There wasn't a single piece of concrete physical evidence tying anyone to the crime. The scene itself had yielded nothing useful. No fingerprints, no personal items, and no biological traces that could later be tested with DNA technology as it advanced. Jeff remained on the suspect list, but investigators were forced to keep looking. Tips poured in from the community, yet every lead fizzled out. High school students began pointing fingers at one another, and in some cases, even bragged to friends that they were the killer. But when those same students were hauled in for questioning, they quickly backpedaled, claiming it was all a bad joke. Cruel pranks in the wake of a real murder. Before long, investigators began looking closely at Tina's stepfather. They learned that his marriage to Tina's mother had recently fallen apart, the result of his heavy drinking and increasingly aggressive behavior. Friends and relatives of Tina's mother confided to police that he had been physically abusive, though she herself denied it. Despite the separation, he had been trying to win her back. Just days before the murder, he showed up at the house unannounced. The visit quickly spiraled into a heated argument, with Tina stepping in to shout at him to leave her mother alone. When detectives brought him in, he claimed he'd been at work when Tina was killed, and his co-workers backed him up. But then they uncovered a detail that made them pause. After hearing about Tina's death, he had taken a bus driven by an acquaintance to her mother's house. Before getting off, he handed the driver a knife and asked him to hold it for a while. To police, this was more than suspicious. The man insisted it was nothing sinister. He said he simply didn't want to walk into Tina's mother's home carrying a knife, given that her daughter had just been stabbed to death. Investigators pressed further, but his alibi held. Eventually, they were forced to cross his name off the suspect list. 5 days later, a fresh lead surfaced, and it was a big one. In the town of Felton, about 50 miles from Pleasanton, a young woman was walking through an underpass when a stranger attacked her. He threatened to kill her if she didn't do exactly as he said. But she managed to break free and sprint to safety, reporting the assault to police immediately. Detectives working Tina's case were immediately struck by how closely the Felton assault mirrored her murder. Before long, they tracked down the suspect, a 23-year-old man named Walter, and placed him under arrest. When they began digging into his past, an unsettling picture emerged. Walter had been living in Pleasanton at the time Tina was killed, only to move away almost immediately afterward. On the very day of the murder, he had visited his grandmother, visibly agitated, and told her he didn't like where his life was headed. Armed with a warrant, police searched Walter's home. Inside, they discovered clothing stained with blood and 2 knives, both of which were also streaked in red. It seemed like a breakthrough until the lab results came back. The blood wasn't human at all, but animal. The development was a blow to the investigation. Detectives continued to press for evidence linking Walter to Tina's murder, but nothing they found would stick. Eventually, they shifted focus. Though Walter's name was never erased entirely from their list of persons of interest. In the weeks that followed, a more unsettling theory began to take shape. What if Tina's killer hadn't stopped? Over the next few months, 3 more young women were murdered in and around Pleasanton. Though the cases differed in some details, investigators began to suspect they might be connected. The possibility of a serial predator sent shockwaves through the once quiet community. Women avoided walking alone. Parents kept their children within arm's reach. Public pressure on the police department intensified with each new killing. But despite their efforts, every lead ended the same way, in a dead end. Years slipped by without a single breakthrough in Tina's case. Then, in 1989, tragedy struck again. Another young woman was found murdered in Pleasanton, just a few miles from where Tina's body had been discovered, and once again, near an underpass. The crime bore unsettling similarities to Tina's killing, but like the others before it, the case went cold. It wasn't until 1994 that the investigation took an unexpected turn. By then, DNA analysis had transformed criminal investigations, and forensic experts re-examined evidence from the series of unsolved murders. This time, they got a hit. The DNA belonged to 35-year-old Michael I.D., already serving time for the brutal murder of a 66-year-old woman. With the match in hand, detectives began to suspect Michael in 3 other killings, Tina's included. When investigators shared his photo with Tina's mother, her reaction was immediate. She said she recognized the man, claiming she'd seen him at a barbecue years before Tina's death. She even searched through old family photos for proof. But when she found the picture she had in mind, her heart sank. The man in the photo looked strikingly similar to Michael, but it wasn't him. For years, investigators tried to connect Michael to Tina's murder. They scoured his history, his movements, his acquaintances, but every possible lead came up empty. In the end, they couldn't tie him to 2 of the other killings either. Still, his DNA was enough to convict him in the one case they could prove, and he was sentenced to death. 2 years later, in 1996, another cold case cracked open. This time, DNA pointed to a man named Robert Rhodes. But just like before, the relief was short-lived. No evidence connected him to Tina's murder. Over the next decade, A handful of new names surfaced as possible suspects, but each one denied any involvement, and with no evidence to prove otherwise, the investigation ground to a halt once again. Then, in 2007, Detective Dana Savage decided to take another look. Pregnant at the time and unable to take on her usual field assignments, she shifted her focus to cold cases. And that's when Tina's file landed on her desk. Savage read through every report, every witness statement, every scrap of evidence collected over the years. Nothing pointed clearly to a killer. But one strange detail refused to leave her mind. Tina's bag, found hanging from a tree near the crime scene. Savage knew Tina couldn't have thrown it up there in the middle of a brutal attack. Whoever killed her had to be the one who did it. By then, forensic technology had advanced far beyond what investigators had in 1984. Savage decided to gamble on a theory. During the frenzied assault, 44 stab wounds in total, the killer might have injured himself. If so, even a microscopic droplet of blood could have landed on that bag before he tossed it into the branches. The local lab didn't have the tools to detect such an old, tiny trace of blood, so the bag was sent to the FBI's crime lab. And there it sat. For years. Finally, in March 2011, Savage got the call she had been waiting for. The FBI had found it. Minuscule traces of blood clinging to the fabric of Tina's bag. Even more stunning, they'd managed to build a complete DNA profile. When the sample was run through the national database, it hit. The blood belonged to Stephen Carlson. When the name came through the line, Detective Savage froze. She had been certain the DNA would point to one of two other longtime suspects already serving time. But this name, Stephen Carlson, was no stranger to her. He'd been buried deep in the case files for decades. Carlson had walked the same school halls as Tina back in 1984. He was just 16 then, and if you remember, he was the boy shoved headfirst into a trash bin near the cafeteria on the very day Tina was killed. He was also the student who steered police toward Jeff, the knife-carrying bully once high on the suspect list. In those early days, detectives had even considered Carlson himself a possible suspect, but they'd found nothing solid to pin on him. Still, his reputation preceded him. Around school, Stephen Carlson was known for crude, sexually explicit comments to girls and sudden bursts of aggression. The other kids kept their distance, whispering behind his back and calling him Creepy Carlson. Isolated and angry, Carlson was often the target of bullying, something that seemed to fuel his rage. By 15, he'd already fallen into heavy drug use, a habit that sent his behavior spiraling further out of control. He bounced in and out of juvenile detention for minor crimes, never staying locked up for long. Over the years, several acquaintances went to police with chilling claims. Carlson had told them he'd killed Tina. But each time officers confronted him, he brushed it off as a joke. There was never enough to hold him. After leaving high school, Carlson graduated to adult prison, serving 2 years for attempted assault. Freedom didn't slow him down. He went straight back to drugs and even refused to register as a sex offender, racking up more arrests along the way. By late 2010, Stephen Carlson was living on the streets, his life unraveling under the weight of addiction. That December, he was arrested for drug possession. For the first time, his DNA was taken and entered into the national database, a seemingly routine step that would prove pivotal. 6 months later, the FBI finally completed testing on Tina's purse. The results were explosive. The microscopic traces of blood belonged to Stephen Carlson. By then, Carlson was already serving time for the drug charge, so detectives went straight to the prison to confront him. The moment they said Tina's name, his demeanor shifted, tense, uneasy, but he still denied any involvement. The DNA told a different story. Convinced they had their killer, investigators charged Carlson with murder. His defense attorney fought to have the case moved to juvenile court, arguing that Carlson was only 16 when Tina was killed. The judge wasn't swayed. The request was denied, and the case was bound for adult court. What followed was 3 years of legal maneuvering. Carlson stayed locked up the entire time. Then, in a cruel twist of fate, tragedy struck again. On the very day jury selection was set to begin, Tina's mother suffered a fatal heart attack. She would never live to see her daughter's killer face justice. The trial was postponed yet again, eventually opening in October 2014. Despite his lawyer's efforts to cast doubt, the jury was unmoved. Stephen Carlson was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 26 years to life in prison. Even then, he refused to take responsibility. From his cell, Carlson declared his innocence and filed an appeal, determined to fight the verdict. For years, Stephen Carlson's conviction wound its way through the appeals process. Then, in 2017, his attorney scored a partial victory. The court agreed the prosecution hadn't definitively proven Carlson intended to kill Tina, which meant the first-degree murder conviction wouldn't stand. The charge was downgraded to second-degree murder, and his sentence was cut to 16 years to life. Even with this reduction, Carlson refused to acknowledge his guilt, at least not publicly. Then, in 2020, everything changed. From behind prison walls, Carlson penned 3 letters, one to Tina's family, one to the police, and one addressed directly to Tina herself. For the first time in more than 3 decades, he accepted responsibility and laid out his version of what happened that April afternoon in 1984. Carlson wrote that he'd been seething with anger after being humiliated at school earlier that day when classmates shoved him into a trash can. Adding to his fury, his house was still a wreck from a party he'd thrown the night before, and he knew his father would punish him for it. Fueled by frustration and alcohol, he stormed home after school, grabbed a kitchen knife, and started walking aimlessly in the opposite direction, with no clear plan in mind. As he emerged from the shadows of the underpass, he spotted Tina. In his own words, without thinking, he launched into a frenzied attack. Carlson claimed he had no memory of the assault itself, only the image of standing over Tina's lifeless body, the knife in his hand dripping with blood. In his letter to Tina and her family, he wrote an apology that came far too late, admitting she had done nothing to deserve what happened to her. Even with his sudden confession, many questioned whether Stephen Carlson truly felt remorse. Under the terms of his sentence, he could one day walk free, but only if a parole board believed he was genuinely sorry and no longer a danger to society. For convicted murderers who maintain their innocence, parole is nearly impossible. That's why some suspected Carlson's letters were less about conscience and more about strategy, a calculated move to improve his chances of release. If that was his goal, it didn't work. His first bid for parole was denied, and he remains behind bars. Still, his sentence allows for repeated attempts, meaning there will be other chances, and one day, the board might decide differently. After Carlson's arrest, a wave of voices from the past emerged. Former classmates spoke up, claiming that back in 1984, almost everyone at school suspected him. He'd already been a social outcast, avoided, ignored, and whispered about. But despite the rumors, police at the time were chasing other, seemingly stronger leads, and no one ever came forward with anything concrete. In the end, it wasn't gossip or suspicion that brought him down. It was the precision of modern DNA science and the relentless persistence of Detective Dana Savage. Ironically, if Carlson hadn't been arrested for drug possession in 2010, his DNA never would have been entered into the national database. And even if investigators had tested the tiny speck of blood on Tina's purse years earlier, the result would have been meaningless without that match in the system. That single twist of fate, a drug arrest decades later, was what finally sealed his fate. Without it, Stephen Carlson might still be a free man today, and Tina's murder might have remained a mystery forever. Be sure to let us know what you think of the story in the comments below. And if you like this video, smash the like button and don't forget to subscribe. A playlist is going to pop up right now with more videos you'll love. See you guys next time.